We're going to do something a little different today on this show. We're going to talk about everyone's favorite politics. Oh my God, this is going to be great. Welcome to So to Speak. I am your host, Evan Mead. My dear co-host Lyle Groniger has kindly requested to opt out of today's episode, not because he is not a political person. Rest assured, Lyle does vote in Canadian elections, both federally, provincially, regionally, whenever he has to. But talking politics is just not something he's good at and prefers not to at all costs. Not good. He's not that he's an apolitical person. He just didn't want to do it today. So we're gonna try something different today. So I'm gonna lead this episode solo. But I've got two wonderful guests, and it's going to be equally packed and equally as intriguing and as equally fun as any other episode that you've heard us do over the last couple of months. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome two good friends of mine who I've had some of the richest intellectual conversations about society over the past 5 to 6 years. Holy jeez. I'd like to welcome As'ad Hamid. As'ad, you are a correct me if I'm wrong about this. Holistic doctor, medical practitioner based in Toronto. And where were you born, buddy?
So I was born in Pakistan, and then I grew up traveling around the world, lived in Pakistan, Australia, Indonesia, China, Spain, the United States, Singapore, and Canada. Canada is my home now. So I've traveled the world, and I've been a practicing lawyer. And at some point, I found my passion for helping people through naturopathic medicine, and that's what I do now in Toronto.
Oh, nice. That's incredible, man. And the next buddy of mine I'd like to introduce is Jody Aberdeen. Jody is a ghostwriter, and he's been doing that for as long as I can remember. Guy has a wicked knack for penning some of the most intellectual, deep pieces I've ever read, just on social media. And I still need to read your book, buddy. But Jody, whereabouts are you from?
It's a good question. Thanks, Evan. And actually, it is. I have been doing this as long as I've known you because that's when I started doing it. It was around the time that we met, ghostwriting. And I have a few books. So which one haven't you read? We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that after.
Yeah, your most recent.
I'm in Dundas, Ontario, which is a reluctant subsidiary of Hamilton, Ontario.
Okay.
And they were part of the amalgamation. It's really its own place.
Yeah.
And one thing I want to add too, in terms of the politics, is something of a segue, is that even though I'm fairly independent, you could say left-leaning progressive guy now, I was once a very active conservative. So I have a very I have a perspective on the topic we're about to discuss.
Right. Okay. So thank you very much for pointing that out. And so my occupation is I'm a podcast host, writer, filmmaker, activist, and the reason why I want to host today's show is because we're all Canadians, but correct me if I'm wrong, but we've all I haven't lived in the United States. As'ad, I believe, and both of you have spent some considerable time in the United States. Is that correct?
Yeah, I lived in Boston for 9 years, from 1999 to 2006 or 2007.
Oh, wow. So yeah. So I spent probably 2 months out of my entire existence just in terms of vacation time in the United States. So that's nothing compared to you, man. Jody, how long did you stay in the States?
I never stayed in the States.
Oh,
no.
Didn't you didn't you go to California for a while, or
For a week?
Oh, okay, my mistake. I sorry.
No, I minored in, well, I'll tell you, my studies at university. I studied history and English at McMaster right here in Hamilton with a minor in poli sci. And for both of those fields of study, I had a focus on US politics, US history.
Mhm.
It caught my interest
Nice.
in a way. So I have, while it's been 20 years, and of course, you know how you take a test, you take an exam, you write a paper, and 3 days later you forgot what you studied.
Yeah.
I remember enough that I can bring some of this conversation.
Cool. Okay. So, see, but none of us, so I don't think like any of us have like degrees in political science, and none of us have ever really ran for office. Well, actually, Jody, my mistake. I back in the day, right before I met you, Jody, and a year before I met you, Assad, I actually, my ex-girlfriend, who I actually remained close with, was contacted by the Green Party of Ontario to run
Mm,
for the local Richmond Hill riding in the 2014 provincial election where Kathleen Wynne was officially elected by the people of Ontario, and that's when yeah. So basically, uh, my ex, who I was still friends with, accepted the nomination and went to the debate, and she gave me the job as her campaign manager, and it was kind of even though I had never done campaign managing before, or I had never campaigned for another person. Of any party. It was a very interesting experience to just get a crash course in learning about what's important to the community. Because even though we weren't experts in anything, we just accepted a nomination. We learned a great deal about what mattered most to the riding we lived in, which at the time was Richmond Hill. We both live in separate ridings right now. And Jody, talk a little bit about what it was like being a part of the Hamilton Chamber of Commerce, because you were telling me about that.
yeah, I still am.
Oh,
I
great.
recently joined. Yeah. Um, I guess for the sake of time, it's a business networking community. It is very progressive in its outset, in its mindset generally. Which is to say that the Chamber of Commerce in Hamilton doesn't have that kind of stuffy, overly corporate feel. It's very much in the community, very much dealing with the issues of poverty, inequality, and prosperity in our city.
Yeah.
And it's a great way to connect. They say like attracts like. So when you get enough progressive businesses and individuals in one organization, you tend to change the organization and for the better, I think.
Okay.
So, yeah, so it's been great. And it doesn't really have a bearing on politics, to be honest. Chambers of Commerce, I think people think that's what it is,
Oh,
but
okay.
it's really a business networking thing. It's a way that you can really help to build up the economic well-being of your community. It's not terribly or it's not always overtly political. That's not where my politics background comes in.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of.
Evan, can we pause for a second?
Yeah, sure. What's up?
Okay. Um, I thought we were talking about Trump.
We are.
I just want to be mindful for time. We're taking 12 minutes to kind of get clear.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, so why don't we focus on the questions, if that's
Okay.
okay?
So,
Yeah.
the reason why I want to set the stage for all this is because um, we're going to talk about the upcoming U.S. election, which is by the time this episode airs, shy of 2 weeks away. And this election is going to be a very big one in terms of what is at stake for the United States. And just so I want to kind of set the stage for like describing our political background. So if you're someone listening to this who is pro-Trump, you're not exactly going to get the Trump love fest that you might have been looking for. So if you're looking for a Trump love fest, look elsewhere. We're going to talk about this president, what he's done over the last 4 years now, because he's due for re-election, and we're going to talk about like what he's done, what in our this is our respective opinions, what we think his biggest success were, because I believe in giving credit where credit's due. If he did something that is optimal or moves the country forward in the right direction, we'll point it out if we find it. There is one thing I think he did right that comes to mind, but other than that, I'm not satisfied with the job he's done. And even though I'm not American, we come from the most integral relationship that the United States has with a foreign country, and that's Canada. So our opinion is just as valid in my heart for what happens with U.S. elections. And yeah, so if you're also one of those people who's like, uh, who cares you live in Canada? This isn't the show for you. So without further ado, let's just jump into it. Um, what was it? How did Trump? I'll let both of you guys answer, and then I'll interject. How do you guys think he won the 2016 election 4 years ago? Because that was a very interesting time in American history and world history too.
So how did Trump win in 2016? Well, he didn't win the popular vote, but he won enough votes in the Electoral College to win the election and become elected as the president of the United States.
Yes.
So that's, I think, a product of how the American electoral system works.
Right.
And you have a country with an enormous it's got a huge population. It spreads across this continent, and it's really home to people with incredibly diverse views who have a right to express their opinion because of the U.S. political system. Some of whom have a right to express their opinion and vote, and some of whom are disenfranchised and can't vote because of their status as undocumented immigrants or their history as felons in the system. So, and then you have people who can vote and who are enfranchised, but either are not engaged in the political process or are disillusioned with the political process. So when you end up having this chunk of the electorate that does vote and cast votes, a lot of them voted for Trump, a lot of them voted for Hillary Clinton. And then despite not winning the popular vote, Donald Trump was elected president of the United States by virtue of having won more electoral votes. In terms of how did he win, how did he garner so much support? From a cultural standpoint, that's a different question than the political logistics of it. He spoke to a segment of the American electorate that was dissatisfied and disillusioned with the politics of the Obama era. And he had a number of people voting for him who felt that they wanted something different. And they connected with his personality and his history as this reality television star that spoke to their probably desire for, somebody who they saw as a straight shooter. And so I think that you had a sense that there were a lot of people out there who felt that politicians were doing too much politicking. And for better or for worse, they saw in Donald Trump somebody who was a straight shooter. Whether or not that's the case, whether or not that was a calculated image that he constructed is besides the point. The fact is, when people who voted for Donald Trump looked at him, they said, here's somebody who I perceive to be a very successful businessman, somebody who's a straight shooter, that if you don't do a good job, he'll kick you out. And if you do a good job, he'll promote you. And so it kind of spoke to a desire for simplicity and for straightforwardness that people felt was lacking from their selections or the options that were available to them in politics. So I think, he was there. It was the right place, the right time, and he made himself out to be the right guy. And he set himself up for that by appealing to various sensibilities in America, which include, the cultural wars that have been happening for a long time, racism that exists in the culture, whether or not people are willing to grapple with it. And I think a sense of disenfranchisement or exclusion from really how the country could be working better for the people who inhabit it. Yeah. So he won because people wanted him as president, and enough people wanted him to be the president because they didn't like what was going on already.
Yeah. I think that's a great answer. It's actually kind of similar to what I was gonna say. That's great, Jody. Do you have anything to add to that? I guess some more. How do you interpret Trump's win?
So I think before I can answer that, there's one thing that we should acknowledge, which is the fact that our views on Trump and politics in general have been distorted for the last 10 years, thanks to social media.
Yeah.
I want to acknowledge that because right now we're in a lockdown, or we're going back into a lockdown situation with the COVID-19 pandemic. And one thing that's really become clear, even before this, is that almost 100% of the information many people get is through social media platforms that distort and often misrepresent some of the information that we get in. So even if you're watching, for all the critiques of mainstream media and the coverage that they would provide to some of these events, like the 2016 election, it's really something that we can't really trust any of the information out there. And one of the things that has marked this era has been the era of distrust of institutions, of politicians, of leaders. And in fact, the very media platforms, through which we get our information, unless we're witnessing them directly, we can't possibly know.
That's true.
And in that atmosphere of uncertainty, combined with the economic challenges that people were having for the longest time, and this real sense of fear and fear for the future and how well is everything going to turn out.
Yeah.
You have a guy who comes in who's a familiar face, like him or not, thanks to all that time, who tells you things are going to be great again.
Right.
And I don't think one of the critiques I've heard of the liberal side actually came from an Aaron Sorkin exchange in one of his shows. He said, forgive the language. He said, if liberal, you know why people hate liberals? Because they lose. If liberals are so fucking smart, quote, then why do they lose so goddamn always?
Yeah.
It's because liberals think typically that they're smarter than everybody, and they tend to be very well educated. But that leads to that very sense of condescension. You're a country bumpkin if you're voting conservative, and I think that was part of that. That was one part of the reason why. You have this guy coming in, who everybody knows, who represents. He's an icon, whether you like him or not.
That's true. Yeah.
Of the American dream, that says you can do it too, even though he inherited his money. But it was essentially speaking to those hopes and fears and familiarity of Americans who were looking for some certainty in uncertain times.
Yeah.
And harnessing the power of social media in a good and bad way. And not all that was him. A lot of that was interference from foreign powers, right? Who realized that you could weaponize the algorithmic aspects of these platforms to feed back the same message and sow division within a population. So what's made it extraordinary is Trump is on the one hand responsible for a great deal of atrocities. Let's call them what they are.
Yeah.
And at the same time, what's remarkable is that an unusually large segment of the population agree with him still.
That is very true.
You see, if we were operating under my politics career as a conservative was pre-social media from 1999 until for most of the early 2000s as a conservative. So we didn't have this, right?
Yeah.
As I've been trying to tell some of my Canadian conservative friends they start wondering about Trump, they start wondering about the reaction. I had to explain to them this way. I said this: the types of people that in the Canadian conservative movement anyway, we used to kick out of the party, the extremists, are now running the party, or they're running the movement, right?
Yeah.
And that's the key difference. It's the same facade, it's the same logos, a lot of the same statements.
Yeah.
But it's the people that we had deemed too extreme who are now in favor in the movement.
I find that very intriguing as well.
It is. And the other part, too, is that the general public sort of getting back to this, right?
Yeah.
When I see a conservative on my Facebook feed, I see a caricature of a real human being. I only see the memes that describe the conservatives at their worst, right? Yeah. And the thing is, I can't possibly know, as long as I'm logged in as me, I can't possibly know any different because my news feed has been tailored to me based on what I've already clicked and based on what that does is it leads to a wholesale lack of empathy.
Yeah.
If I go to my father's a conservative, and if I go to his Facebook page, I see caricatures of liberals and progressives. Yeah. And if that's all my experience of the world is, then that's how I think the world is. And I'm going to vote accordingly, whether or not it's lined up with the facts.
Yeah.
So leading this back to Trump now, that's in large part how he got elected. It's in large part how he's very likely to get reelected.
Right. Oh. So I think we're gonna have like this is going to be a few questions from now, but I have a different view on how you think it's gonna go. Um,
Mhm.
but it's interesting to hear your 2 cents. It's always good to get that diversity of opinion. Um,
Mhm.
one of the things I so can you, if you could sum it up in one sentence, like why did you transition away from being on the right to being a little more of a progressive? Because that's what I identify as too. Just for the sake of posterity, I identify more as a progressive. I wouldn't call myself a liberal. I prefer progressive more so than liberal. But yeah, why did you steer away from that movement?
I want to clarify, I'm not an ideologue of any kind.
Right.
So I am a conscious, deliberate independent who leans progressive on many issues.
Oh, okay.
And the reason I did that was because when I was a conservative, I was an ideologue. I don't, if if one ideology can shape my worldview and cause me to miss out on somebody else's perspective, then all of them do. And
Yeah.
that's not and that's not something that I want to have for myself.
Right.
So what got me being a conservative, strangely enough, was the same types of identity politics. We didn't have a name for it then, but it was then, right? I was really dealing with the fact that I'm an immigrant from the Caribbean, raised here since I was a baby, not
Yeah.
fitting in with other Trinidadians, which is where my birth country is, right?
Right.
But never quite fitting in with Canadians. On the inside, I'm basically a Canadian. They used to say, people of my ethnicity, they call it the word is coconut. I'm brown on the outside, white on the inside,
Ah.
right? And it's like, how do I fit in, right?
Right.
And so I tend to get not excluded, but othered by predominantly white Canadians based on my appearance.
Yeah.
But then as soon as I open my mouth, they recognize that I'm really one of them. On the other hand, I can go to Trinidad and wander around not saying anything, and the people just assume I'm Trinidadian until I open my mouth,
Oh, wow.
right? So when I got into politics, one of the things that got me was I was in the room of my back then we had grade 13 in Ontario's high school system.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Now it's just grade 12. So I was in grade 13 politics class, which I was dabbling in. And I said, I don't understand why we can't accept just being Canadian. What's with all this emphasis on a hyphen between your homeland and this one?
Right.
And I got called a racist by other brown people. And I said, I really was just asking.
Right.
When I went to Mac later on, I met up with members of different political parties, the campus clubs.
Oh, okay.
And here's what happened. I sat with the liberal guy and he said, where are you from? And I said, oh, I came in from Brampton. Oh, where are you from really? What country are you from? It's like,
Ah.
okay. And then I sat with the NDP guy and he's like, hey, so I was like, hey, so where are you from? I said, Brampton. He's like, no, what country are you from?
I roll.
Right.
Yeah.
Here was the key difference. I sat with a conservative. What do you think of the flat tax? Isn't it a great idea?
Oh.
That's how it was back then for me. I
Wow.
had because they were hostile towards the notion of identity politics. Now that carries with it a lot of willful blindness to social inequality. I want to acknowledge that.
Of course.
But for one kid, 20 years old, thereabouts, getting introduced to this world of politics in Canada, to be appreciated for what I actually thought and believed versus the color of my skin, however inadvertent, right? And however well intentioned it was by the progressive parties, right?
Yeah.
Meant a lot to me. So I went into the movement.
Yeah.
And I was in the Progressive Conservatives. I was in the Canadian Alliance back then. Then I was there for the merger. I met Mike Harris, Stockwell Day, Jason Kenney. We went to Stornoway at one point because they were in opposition, right?
Oh, okay.
And what was interesting is that as much as we didn't like the Liberals, as much as the Conservatives there were a little bit of a seditious bunch, always talking about, hey, we should join the states someday, right? Especially after George W. Bush became president. It was really, it seemed as if there was some sanity involved. So whenever we had somebody saying, advocating for the abolition of abortion rights, for example, we would kick them out. It's like, no, women have a right to choose. So there was that kind of lingering bit of sanity, progressive sanity, right?
Oh,
Or
okay.
at least centrist sanity in the party and in the movement. What got me leaving it was a series of things over the years. So first, when the Americans lied about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq,
Ah.
that was the first one. That was a betrayal. Because you want to support the wartime president, and you want to assume that the president of the United States is somebody who can be trusted, however naively that may seem, especially if he's from your own party, or at least from your own movement. So that was one. The second thing was the creeping advance of anti-scientific sentiment when it came to climate change. That started creeping in. That wasn't always the case. The conservatives were at one point recognized the need to deal with climate change, but they wanted a market solution. Now that's still around today, but it's been weaponized since, right?
That's true.
But what got me was when people started saying, I don't think it's really happening. Climate change is a hoax. I think it's a liberal scam. I think it's a globalist scam. When the conspiracy thinking started coming in direct contradiction to what every scientist was saying, right? That was when I started thinking, if you're willing to tolerate this in the movement, maybe there's something I'm not seeing. And then it only got worse after Obama, and that was something else too. Would this have happened? Would the movement have been like this if the president had been white?
I do think that does play a part, and I remember seeing a Vox video where it's basically a montage of right-wing leaders and right-wing politicians in the U.S. excuse me, talking about climate change. It started with like Bush and his cronies in the mid-2000s talking about the issue after Al Gore started sounding the alarm. He made that documentary called An Inconvenient Truth. Progressively, as time goes on, the Republicans and right-wingers in the U.S. go from saying, yeah, well, climate change is a big problem and we have to deal with it. However, terrorism's a bigger problem, so we have to deal with that before we deal with climate change. It went from that argument to, yeah, climate change is fake. And it's really intriguing is to see how that progressively slipped away from people.
Exactly. So, and I realized that ideology was keeping us very much locked up there. So now, on the flip side, I had ample opportunity to observe the left wing from a conservative standpoint, and this is what, as a conservative, I remember we were afraid of.
Yeah,
the left wing is very eager to suppress dissenting opinion.
Right.
So whether it's naming and shaming, whether it's possibly doxing people, right? These are the extremes that they talk about. And I think sometimes when now that I've been in progressive movements, I remember this, right? It's like we have to be able to tolerate disagreement.
Yeah.
And we don't do that. And increasingly, once again, pointing to the age of social media, where we have had these platforms turned on us, right? If we're now in bubbles where all we see is agreement. And whenever somebody expresses even a slightly, when you question the orthodoxy of the day, you're in big trouble. You can be canceled, And so when I hear all these things in the conservative movement, I think a lot of it's disingenuous, frankly, right?
Yeah.
But they're not wrong. And while we're doing this, all politics these days, like this podcast, are performative actions a lot of the time. Everything's performative, which means as much as you're tuning into the people who you're hearing, there are the so-called silent masses that every side invokes at some point to justify, hey, the silent masses are going to come out for me. The silent masses are going to come out for Biden, for Trump, for Bernie, right? The silent masses are sitting here watching, where they frankly don't play this game.
Yeah.
They're spectators. When the time comes for them to vote, they're going to vote. So I want to go back to election night 2016. I went to bed thinking Hillary had got this thing in a walk.
Yeah, so did I.
I didn't go to bed.
Was it the same for you?
I was like, oh God, what's happening? I didn't expect this.
Yeah. And you see, what's funny is that, so one of the problems that they had, because they did the postmortem saying, how could the pollsters have failed so badly? And part of that was the information collection methods, right?
Right.
A lot of them were still using landline telephone numbers. And people with landline telephone numbers don't live in cities.
Oh my God, yeah.
Right?
That's really concerning when you look at the current lead.
Well, hang on. Let me finish that thought, actually, right? So the infrastructure that the polling companies used traditionally had changed. They tried to adapt it to more electronic, things so that you can have the new generation in. But what you had happen was a large segment of the population. I'm wrong on these details. I know that. So someone's going to have to verify this, right?
Okay.
The basic idea was this. There was a bias built into the responses they were getting that were ignoring the real numbers. The sampling was problematic because a lot of the technology they were using tended to be used by people who would vote for Hillary Clinton.
Oh.
The actual polling, the actual turnout was predominantly based by people who never got reached by those, and they tended to be conservative and voted for Trump.
Oh.
So this is why when you see the polling numbers today, a lot of the time they haven't fixed that.
Oh my God.
So that's why there's a very large likelihood we're trending in a lot of ways the same way we did in 2016, which is why I'm saying he's going to win. I'm not even all that worried about it, frankly. I'm worried about the consequences of him winning, but I'm not agonizing over him winning because it's probably going to happen.
Well, that's really interesting because, As'ad, I feel like thank you for that, As'ad. I feel like we'd be, given how Jody just went into his background, I feel like we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about, like, your perception of politics. Growing up in Pakistan and living in the U.S. for almost a decade. So yeah, like, I feel like if you want to shed a little light on that, feel free. But yeah, so that's given us a lot to think about.
Well, I think, I think I really enjoyed hearing Jody's story because, and the evolution of the way that he came to his current views. And I really like his emphasis on his autonomy and his ability to be an independent with progressive views. I think that that's something that we should encourage more in our culture. And we should really look at the education system to allow people to be really free and autonomous to decide who they are, who they want to be, and to change their minds at any time.
Yeah.
I think a principle that I hold very important is that as a human being, a person is always allowed to change their mind. This comes up in my work all the time. I'm a doctor. I deal with patients. And before I begin any procedure of any kind, I always say, I just want to remind you that you have the ability to withdraw consent at any time. So if there's anything that I'm about to do that you would like me to stop doing, please say the word stop and I will stop immediately. And so that means any physical examination, whether it's listening to their heart or whether it's palpating their prostate for a digital rectal exam to find if there's a mass there, or whether it's doing acupuncture. So in my personal life or my professional life as a doctor, consent is very important to me. Right? And by the same virtue, human freedom, autonomy, and dignity are important to me. And I think that, the United States, just, acknowledging its history of slavery and classism and racial divides and class divides and disenfranchisement of a massive chunk of its population, including women, until relatively late in the game, in the 30s and the 40s, and then after that, the continuing disenfranchisement under Jim Crow of African Americans who had been given the right to vote with the constitutional amendment in the 1800s. All of those things, they strike me at the core because it really speaks to my belief in the ability that everyone should have the same rights and the same dignity.
Yeah.
So those things are very important and meaningful to me. So I enjoyed hearing about Jody's story because I thought, here's somebody who really seems to value, Jody, your freedom and your independence and your right to autonomy, and really looking at and acknowledging the fact that, where you were from and the experience that you had growing up here does speak to how you get to develop your views, but that's okay. Nobody should have to vote a particular way because they were born in history at a particular time in a particular place. Everybody should get to make up their mind about what to be, which is why I feel great empathy towards people who vote for Donald Trump. And I feel great empathy for people who choose not to vote for Donald Trump, because I don't dispute their absolute right to make up their own minds for themselves. And so you have people whose views are being fed to them by social media. And so I think there are structural problems about our polities and our cultures that we need to address collectively. But this is the great human story, right? Like, I don't get too upset when people end up making up their minds in a way that's different from me. I think, well, you have access to this set of facts and I have access to a different set of facts, and you're doing the best you can with the information that you have, and I'm doing the best I can with the information I have. And I know that there are certain things that are painful for you to acknowledge because you have a certain set of beliefs. And so I'm not going to sit here and try and push you into believing what I believe, because I believe in your right to have the beliefs that you have. Of course, that doesn't mean that I think everything's okay. I take stands on issues, and I would fight to try and persuade people. If somebody said to me, "I think human trafficking is okay," I would not sit there and let them say that human trafficking is okay. I wouldn't be
Right.
okay with that. I would try and persuade them. So there are places and issues where I think it's important to stand up and fight and be an activist.
Yeah.
And where does that come from? I think really more than where I grew up, it comes from the values that I grew up with and the family that I have. I come from a country that's a relatively young country, Pakistan. It was created, or it was partitioned with India, the modern state of India, the modern state of Pakistan, were partitioned from the British Empire in the subcontinent of India in 1947. And you have this incredibly diverse society with people from all kinds of ethnicities. And so I grew up in, an urban environment in that part of the world, in a country that has so many languages and ethnicities that are all kind of bound together by this idea of a country that was created for a specific purpose to give a homeland to the Muslims. And I'm doing air quotes right now. You can't see that. A homeland to the Muslims who were, because there was a fear that they were a minority in India at the time. So you have this very, very diverse country. So I couldn't really say it speaks to where I'm from. It more speaks to the small segment of the urban population that my family grew up with. And you have this country which is huge, and it has people from villages all over the world, all over the country that are completely different from. They have experiences completely different from the experience I had. So I represent a really small minority of Pakistani people who were fortunate enough to have this access to education, and who lived in the big cities, and who grew up with a very much a Western inflected perspective.
Yeah.
And experience with Western education and Western ideals. And so I grew up reading Western history and learning about democracy and those ideals. So yeah, I think I do have an allegiance to Western liberal ideals. And that's something I grew up with. So I think I would be different from Jody in the sense that I wouldn't say I'm an ideologue, but I tend to be very sympathetic to liberal and progressive positions. So for me, I do have to exercise my that part of myself that acknowledges that I have a bias. Right. I do have a liberal bias. I tend to sympathize with liberal perspectives on issues, and I'm okay with that because I have friends who have conservative biases.
Yeah,
I think we all have the right to have our biases, and I think that what it matters to me most is respectful disagreement and respectful agreement. Yeah. And I think that, what's sad about today's politics is that we, like Jody was saying, we get our caricatures and then we instantly demonize people. And I think that that's what's wrong with the world today, is that we are manipulated sometimes by human actors and sometimes by artificial intelligence and sometimes by algorithms that were written by well-meaning people, but people who are also, incentivized by money or fame or ego or status to write things that without really taking into account the effect it would have on everybody. And that leads people like us, and to end up caricaturing and demonizing people without really taking into account the human cost of all this kind of knee-jerk reactions that we end up having. So all I would say is to people today is that, if you believe something, you have a right to say it, but also take a moment to think about the other side and then act accordingly.
Yeah. That's very powerful. Just want to go a little bit into like my political background. I got to be completely honest. My understanding of politics in both Canada and the U.S. is very not new, but I kind of educated myself after Trump won because I was in the bubble of Hillary's going to crush him on the virtue that he's got no political experience, and then I saw he won, and then I was very very hurt by the fact that the American public had voted for a man who I thought was very cruel and very demeaning. But then instead of wallowing in that offense and that hurt, I got myself educated on why it went the way it did. And here's what I've learned. For first, a little context. In 2008, Barack Obama got elected. I watched that election in real time when I was in 11th grade, and it was a very profound moment in history to be a part of as a teenager, just to watch all that go down. I watched him get elected because the American people were sick of the way things were from 2000 to 2008 with 8 years under Bush. 9/11 happened. The foreign policy of how America interacts on the world stage had been changed possibly forever under the policies that Bush enacted, and he led the country into an illegal offensive war. And also he crashed the economy as kind of like the cherry on top of that, shit Sunday that was the Bush presidency. So he left the White House in disgrace, and people voted for Obama because Obama preached this message of change. And then 4 years later, Obama gets reelected on the premise of, okay, the Republicans aren't really offering much in terms of the status quo. The economy's in relatively good shape. Why would we vote Obama out? So he gets 4 more years. And then in that time, his midterms in 2014 are a disaster. He loses control of the Senate and he loses control of the House, the Democrats. And now comes Hillary Clinton in 2016 saying, we're going to go forward and we're going to have more change, except we've had 8 years of Democrats, aka you, in power, and what's happened? Like, we're in a situation where we're not comfortable. So the voting public that has no specific political affiliation is who voted for Trump. I like to tell people that the diehard forever Trumpers, who are like the big radicals, who we like to think are the Hicks, are the ones who like got him elected. I have a feeling that if it was up to the diehard Trump fans, that he wouldn't have won. It was the demographic of the casual voter who took a chance on Trump that got him elected, because they are working individuals who just want a government that's going to make sure that their job doesn't get outsourced. They're not going to lose their health insurance. Life is going to get better for them. They wanted that. They wanted the political system shook up in the US, and they took a chance on Trump. And they told, by the way, they took a chance on Trump, and what compelled them to do that even more was Hillary was shoving this identity politics pill, and the people who supported Hillary, they were shoving this identity politics pill down people's throats, saying, you're sexist if you like Trump because of his whole history with misogyny. You're racist if you like Trump, but you're not those things if you vote for Hillary. If you campaign on that principle alone, you're going to get screwed. Like, people are not going to buy that. And I actually predicted an aspect of the Canadian election, which happened in 2019, on that issue alone of identity politics and social justice warriorism, because in my mind, the conservative movement across the West were embracing their own brand of SJWism, of social justice nonsense. And to them, it looks like vote Republican or vote conservative, or you hate your country, or you hate America, or you hate Canada, or whichever country you live under. So I had a feeling, and when I saw Maxime Bernier, who seceded from the conservative movement in Canada and started a movement to the right, of the Conservatives, the People's Party, he showed up to the debate in 2019, last fall, looking like the outsider, but people had seen that outsider nonsense from Trump. Maxime Bernier tried to run as a populist, but people saw through his charade, and his party got curb stomped out of existence when it was time to go to the polls. He lost his seat. The party is virtually non-existent, but so the right wingers stuck with the conservatives, and even they didn't win. They gained ground, but Andrew Scheer's not the prime minister. So it was, to me, that's why I feel like the right is embracing their own version of, authoritarian shaming when it comes to people's political views. And it's, in my opinion, that it might cost Trump the election. Because, before we get into that, though, and I do want to hear Jody's 2 cents on that, because he does have to go in 12 minutes. So what I'd like to talk about next is, very quickly, but what do you got? I'm going to answer this question first, but I'd like to know, what do you think is the biggest accomplishment of Trump, and what do you think is his biggest failure? And the easy answer to his biggest failure is the way he handled coronavirus, but in the United States. but I think his biggest accomplishment is a backhanded one where after almost starting nuclear war with one of the most dangerous nuclear powers on the planet, North Korea, a year later, after he's like seemingly inches away from blowing up the Hermit Kingdom and taunting Kim Jong Un like it's two two bullies on the playground who disagree with each other. Uh, in my mind, they were this close to blowing each other up, and then there was a historic peace conference. Now it is on shaky ground, granted, and as long as the war hawks in Trump's cabinet don't jeopardize that whatever it's worth peace agreement and that conference, I feel like that was an inadvertent accomplishment of Trump because yes, granted he did escalate to unknown and unprecedented dangerous proportions, but it came out with a historic conference where the supreme leader and the president of the United States actually sat down and talked. That alone is unprecedented under the last 3 administrations before Trump. So I would say credit where credit's due on that. But to me, his biggest failure isn't really. I'm probably going to get shit from this from the political junkies listening to this podcast, but my answer as to what his biggest failure is probably not grounded in any one policy. I'm not as old as you guys are, so I'm a relatively young guy. But in my lifetime, there have been 5 U.S. presidents who have served in office. I was born at the tail end of Bush Sr.'s administration, where Clinton took over, and in the time of my life where I've been able to comprehend politics, I have watched 3 U.S. presidents govern in real time. I've watched Bush address the nation after 9/11. I watched him say, good job, we accomplished the mission in Iraq, we're going home, and then they stayed there. I watched Obama save America from a second Great Depression in 2009, and I watched Trump fail to condemn white nationalism after Charlottesville. When I watched Bush and Obama, no matter what people disagreed with how or what their policies were or what they believed in, I never doubted that they knew that they were in charge of everyone in this country, in America, in the United States. But when I see Trump talk, I personally feel like he feels like he owes the country only what he believes is right. And what I mean by that is I feel like he doesn't look out for anyone except his biggest fans, and he feels like everyone else who criticizes him or just doesn't like him is out to trash what otherwise he feels is his great legacy. He is a president who is for his people and not for the people, and you can't govern like that in any country unless you're a dictator. So that's, in my opinion, he is I've watched all these presidents, 3 presidents govern in real time, and out of the 3, Trump is the only one who feels like he is for just himself and his people, not for everyone. So he was elected by everyone who voted, but he's not for everyone.
Yeah. So I've got because of my time constraint, I want to get this in. So couple things. So he's running. We talk about running government like a business.
Yeah.
What do you think, or like a corporation? What do you think a corporation is? It's a mini It's an authoritarian organization that reports to a chain of command that's not elected.
Yeah.
Right. So when you say you want to run the government like a corporation, you're no longer talking efficiencies. The part of those efficiencies come from the fact that there's a command structure that has nothing to do with what your employees think.
Yeah.
Right. Sure, they can give you that stuff. And so Trump, from a corporate background with no background in politics, of course he's going to run it like this. When you also factor in the fact he seems to have these very sociopathic tendencies, if not psychopathic tendencies, then yes, you have the makings of an authoritarian leader. And it's really, at this point, it's up to the strength of America's institutions to keep him in check.
Yeah.
But if you want to talk about a contribution that he's done, because we could talk, everybody in my political bubble anyway, we can talk about family separations. That's a multi-generational damage that he's already done.
Yeah.
We could talk about raising, appealing to white supremacy and aggravating racial divides. That's a bit of multi-generational damage that he's done. right? That's when he's out of office, we're still going to have to deal with that.
Oh, for sure.
But the if you want to talk about a contribution, he's exposed all of the flaws in the apparatus of the American institutional governance. The presidency, we've become very aware of just how much is done by convention without any type of legislative rules where to govern the behavior. You assume that the president, anybody who's an office holder, is going to be a good person. That originates in a Victorian era understanding of political office. You assume the virtue of somebody who's willing to serve. And that is not reflective of today's setup where you need real checks and balances, real accountability. For example, there's no part of why they can't do it is that they have to, they can't remove him just by fiat is because a lot of what he's doing is technically not illegal. It's within it's technically not illegal. Not that it's wrong, it is wrong. Not that but it's technically not illegal. And this is what holds up legislative bodies, even police officers. So right now we have a crisis in Canada with the Micmac out in Nova Scotia, the fishermen, right?
I'm so glad you brought that up.
And I saw a post, right, where Nova Scotian non-Indigenous fishermen are now burning down, Micmac fish, lobster traps and processing facilities and such. And that's a whole different take, but like a whole different topic. But one of the interesting things I saw on social media was this: the news outlets can't report that something is arson until the police confirm it.
Oh my God.
So now this is an interesting little dilemma because on the one hand, if you say you don't like fake news, then you need verification. Yeah. So according to the journalistic standards that they follow, it's like, it's a duck, it walks like a duck, it flies like a duck, but you can't call it a duck until the police confirm that it's a duck.
Wow.
Right? And that's something else that's kind of interesting. You know exactly what it is, but the media is kind of hamstrung. But you see, these are the types of conversations we've been having in the Trump era about how we do almost everything. I think if social media hadn't been weaponized the way that it is, going back to the initial point, we wouldn't be talking about whether or not this is a good platform.
Yeah.
Right. We wouldn't be aware of the fact that families don't talk anymore.
Yeah.
Because of their politics. Right.
Yeah.
And I think Donald Trump's greatest legacy is not going to be anything great, except that we may get a new American republic out of this. In France, for example, they're on the Fifth French Republic. What they do is they declare every so often when they've been conquered, when they've had to change how the government works for some type of revolution or something else, they declare a new republic and restructures the government every time. The United States has only done this maybe 3 times in its history. They did it during independence. They did it after the Articles of Confederation. They definitely did it after the Civil War. And there's been a case to be made that they did it after the New Deal, right?
Right.
And you could even say the national security state after the war, after World War II, that was another restructuring, right? But they don't declare these, right? They don't make open constitutional changes. I think after this, if after Trump is gone, whenever that is, whether it's in a couple of weeks or 4 years or God knows however long, right?
Yeah.
At this point, it's all up for grabs. I think Americans and the world can no longer just take the current system for granted. There's going to be actual, real structural changes to the context in which they do politics and the institutions. So I think he's going to strengthen the same way that, oddly enough, a virus triggers an immune response. I think America's immune response to Trump is the lineups at the queues for early voting.
Yeah.
It's the new activism that we've seen on the progressive side, calling for things like universal basic income, pointing out, Black Lives Matter. Finally, let's get these issues to the forefront to see that an entire segment of the population is singled out all the time and killed, not even just conceptually or theoretically, quote unquote, oppressed, but actually killed just walking down the street by the very people who are supposed to protect them. This is going to be his legacy. He's triggered a massive immune response in the American people, and hopefully that will trickle down. And the last thing I want to say because this goes back to one of your earlier points before I go, and being able to talk to each other with empathy. So Evan knows this. So one of my late heroes was Anthony Bourdain. He was able to go around the world and talk to people. So he went to West Virginia for one of his episodes, sat with Trump country people, prayer circles around, right? And he is a old liberal Kennedy Democrat, right?
Yeah.
Very lefty, hates Trump. He's from New York. Everybody in New York who knows Trump hates him. They get it.
Yeah.
They live with it, right?
I went to New York twice last year in 2019, and both the times I was there, other than the crazy merchandise that he has in souvenir shops, he's not like there at all.
No, he's not. He's not like there, right? And so, except in the real estate community, they love him. But anyway, so at one point in one of these episodes, Bourdain asked them, because this is during the Trump era, said, Donald Trump, a typical East Coast elite of the kind that you say you hate, right? You know, you got his vote, right? Or sorry, he got your vote. Why did you vote for him? And so in West Virginia, there's a long tradition of coal mining. And the response came was this, right? The lady said, Hillary Clinton came to West Virginia and said, we're gonna make coal mining obsolete. Right? And what she was speaking into was, this is my grandfather was a coal miner, my great grandfather was a coal miner. It's a rite of passage for young men and then recently women to go and basically mine coal. It's a way of life that she basically said she was going to end, as far as they were concerned. And the lady said, well, when she said that, it was very clear who we were going to vote for. Yeah. Now, I shared this and this is my last point, I shared this with a liberal friend, a very progressive friend. And you know what his response to that was?
What was it?
That's not a very nuanced answer. And you see, this is what they don't get. And I said, it doesn't matter. It's their vote.
And it's their worldview.
It's their worldview.
It's their experience. It's their lives.
Yeah. And so it's that type of dismissal that led to Trump in the first place. Now, I don't know, given what he's been releasing onto the country and in the world, if that's going to be as relevant now, because now you actually have something to hit him with, right? Before he doesn't have a record, he doesn't have any accomplishments.
Exactly.
Now he does, and now he has something to shoot at, basically, right? He has something that you can critique. I don't know if it'll make a difference, but maybe this time it might. I think the cues of people lining up to vote is a good sign. That I may be wrong, but at the same time, I don't want to I see a lot of people making 2016 assumptions about the 2020 election.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be part of that. And Evan, thanks. I have to go, but As'ad, nice to meet you.
Pleasure to meet you. And I hope that we can maybe think about scheduling a part 2, because this has been a very interesting conversation.
Yes.
Really excited to hear the point of view that you've had, Jody, and learning from both of you. So maybe we'll talk about scheduling part 2. I'll stick around for another 15 minutes or so, Evan. We can finish up. But
thank you, Evan. Nice to meet you. And likewise, I want to get to learn about you better. So let's schedule a part 2.
That's great. Yeah, definitely.
All right, cheers, boys.
Coming soon.
Okay.
Post-election.
Okay.
Post-election. Okay.
Post-election. Okay.
See you soon, buddy. All right.
Bye.
So we'd like to thank Jody for coming on with us. As'ad and I are going to stick around and talk about this for a few minutes. Jody kind of alluded to a prediction that he had, which he kind of shed some light on how it could be wrong. He said that he gave reasons, As'ad, he gave reasons for why he thinks Trump is going to win. And I honestly, I'm going to be honest with you and our audience here. Up until this podcast, I was under the preface of whoever thinks Trump is going to win is out of touch with reality. But then when I heard Jody's rationale on how the polls are being conducted, I'm like, oh my God, this election is still too close. Like, no matter what it says. The reason why people think Biden, including myself, think Biden is going to win is because he's got too large of a lead over Trump. And at this point in the race in 2016, Hillary could barely get a lead over him. Like, she was, at this point, I believe she was up 2 or 3 points. Biden, I think, is up. Last I checked, Biden was up 16 or 20 points. And he's going to maintain a 10-point lead or more until Election Day because of, well, first we have to address the elephant in the room. The coronavirus pandemic has exposed, as Jody might say, how this country deals with a crisis under a leadership like this. How this country, by and large, deals with this. If there was no COVID-19 pandemic, I would actually say Trump's chances of re-election are excellent, and Biden wouldn't stand a chance because Biden is that expired politician that no one really loves, but no one wants. They like him enough because they know his credentials. They know he was Barack Obama's vice president. They love him for his name and for his notoriety. But other than that, like he doesn't really have much going for him other than his political career and the credentials he has and how charming and warm he can be under the right circumstances with the right people. So that's why he's such a favorite. And well, first off, aside before we get into my prediction, we didn't talk about what you felt like Trump's biggest accomplishments and failures were, because we heard it from Jody and we heard it from me, but we want to hear it from you.
I mean, for me, I think that it's been clear since the pandemic began that he has completely missed an opportunity to be the president of the United States for all of the American people. He has consistently failed to protect the American people from this disease, where the U.S. government and especially the executive branch has the power and the authority and the resources to be the main actors who respond to this kind of crisis. And he squandered those opportunities. And for many, many, many months, he consistently encouraged things to move in the wrong direction by discouraging people from wearing masks, by backhandedly supporting social distancing only when it resonated with his base, and by encouraging the economy to people, different states to open up because he was afraid that the stock market was plummeting.
Yeah.
So he's definitely, that's his biggest failure in one sense of the immediate needs of the American people. But his other massive failure is also to denounce white nationalism until he was pressured to do so repeatedly by liberal pundits and by people who were calling for him to do so because he didn't see any political upside for them. And so ultimately, Trump has been painted, and I think rightfully so, by people who have profiled him, by educated people, by people who are licensed as psychotherapists or who have a background in psychoanalysis. He has been consistently called somebody who is a narcissist and somebody who is transactional. And when he doesn't see that there's any upside to him, he's not going to act. And he only changes his view. So, for example, yesterday an ad was aired on television in America where Trump is featured wearing masks a great deal because his campaign has really caught on to this idea that it's hurting him to not be a supporter of mask wearing.
Well, not only that, he got coronavirus. Like, we have to state that on the record. At this point in history, Trump had he tested positive for COVID-19. He was flown to Walter Reed for a couple of days to be treated. And when I heard the news that he got COVID-19, I thought to myself, this is monumental news, and this is one of the biggest ironies I've ever seen. But we all know, face it, this is the president we're talking about. He's got access to medical procedures and medical technology that's probably classified to the people. So he's going to be fine. Like, no matter, even though he's in the most vulnerable demographic that the virus is most likely to kill, he's going to be fine. And now that he is supposedly fine, he's well enough to go back and debate Biden. Literally right as we're recording this episode, he's set to debate Biden again for a second time. So yeah, the fact that he caught coronavirus, I think, was a wake-up call to the people running his campaign. And to him, and to not so much his base. His base is still going to deny science, because when he got coronavirus, he downplayed it even when he was having it, because he said, don't let the virus dominate your life. You, Mr. President, are in an incredibly privileged position to say shit like that, because what about the family that can't afford medical insurance, who test positive, and let's say their grandma needs a ventilator, and they can't get access to one, and the grandma dies? Like, what do you say to that? You can't just say, don't let it dominate your life. He's talking like a personal development, a personal growth guru who has said this shit constantly over the years. Because I've been around personal growth and development a long time. I've seen so many guys and gals too get up and say, don't let your circumstances run your life. It's a nice message under the right circumstance, but ultimately there are some things that you can't just let slide, and you have to deal with before you can't. I'm not saying, I get his message may have been well attended, but it just got lost on so many people. Sorry to.
Yeah, I agree with you about that. No, I'm glad that you said all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's his base has a certain view of him, and as Jody was saying earlier, he is an icon, and he remains an icon to many people.
Yeah.
And for reasons of that have to do with the circumstances and the times in the history that we grew up in. This is a person who was a New York real estate mogul, whether or not you want to say that he got there because of his own abilities or because he got there because he inherited a lot of money from his dad.
Yeah.
So for better or for worse, he had this position of power and status, and he's used it to continue to advance his power and status till he ascended to the most powerful office in the world by being elected to that office, right? So he didn't just get that by accident. I think that Donald Trump, the only God that he believes in ultimately is the God of spin. And so this is a person who, again, learned, he came of prominence in the age of television.
Yeah.
And television, once upon a time in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, you had network television and you did not have cable television.
Right.
And you had CBS, you had PBS, you had ABC, NBC, and that was pretty much it.
Yeah.
And they had their news anchors, and those news anchors told the truth about what was happening to the best of their knowledge based on what the reporters and the journalists were reporting. And it's before the advent of cable television, which really transformed the way that news is delivered to the masses. And then that was before the advent of social media. So what we've seen in the last 40 years is first cable television coming in and then social media coming in and appealing to people's ability to, or people's need to have news delivered to them in a way that's comfortable with their perceptions and their biases, and really catering the news to present a set of facts or a spin of facts and to change the facts if necessary in order to appeal to the segment of the population so that they can keep their subscription to cable and keep their allegiance and their money and their ratings, right?
Yeah.
So once upon a time, people tuned into the networks and it was a public good. Now people buy cable and people have subscriptions to social media, which is, a different monetization scheme. But ultimately, everybody wants subscribers and they're willing to say what they have to say in order to keep those subscribers. And it's no longer about the public good. So I think when it comes to the message of what's happening with this pandemic, you have Donald Trump's base and you have Donald Trump's MAGA world. And they are this huge thirsty audience that wants the world to be a particular way that continues to serve their needs of their livelihoods, which are valid needs, and their ability to make sense of the world without feeling discomfort and pain. And then you have a set of people who feel differently, and they feel that the world should look different, and it's more an aspirational point of view, perhaps, than it does under the Donald Trump administration. And so, I think that when you look at his record in office, for me, again, with my bias, I see his record as being incredibly blemished and tarnished by his response to the coronavirus pandemic, his failure to really heal the racial divides that exist in American culture today. And then in terms of what accomplishments he has, I think that, it depends on what you believe. Recently, Joe Biden had that town hall on on ABC with George Stephanopoulos. And a gentleman from the audience got up and said, I'm going to list Donald Trump's accomplishments in foreign policy. And do you think that Donald Trump deserves more credit? So this person identified as a registered Republican voter. And they said, the quote from that person, this gentleman, is that peace is breaking out around the world under the Donald Trump presidency, is what he said. I'm paraphrasing, but he definitely, peace is breaking out around the world. And then his implication is that that's because of the Donald Trump presidency. And he credited Donald Trump specifically for the historic agreement between, so he said, between the United Arab Emirates and Israel.
Yeah.
And so those are things that are perceived by that segment of Trump voters as extremely positive developments. Again, what set of facts do you believe? How much information do you have access to? Why do you think that that's a massive success? There are many people who don't believe that UAE Israel agreement was a good thing for relations in the Middle East as well.
Yeah.
So depending on what side you come down on, you may think that Donald Trump should be given credit for his foreign policy accomplishments. You may think that he should be given credit for his engagement with North Korea and his meetings with Kim Jong-un. The fact is, before Donald Trump became president, North Korea did not have a full-on nuclear weapon, and they hadn't held a parade where Kim Jong-un was tearfully crying and celebrating the ICBM that now North Korea now has made public to the world.
Yeah.
So I would say that his engagement with North Korea has been a failure, if anything, because at the start of the administration, they did not have an ICBM and they did not have a parade showing their ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile. Whereas just a week ago, that's exactly what was happening. So as Jody was saying, politics is performative, and all of Donald Trump's engagement with North Korea has been spontaneous, led by his ego, and mostly performative. And the same is true from Kim Jong-un's administration, where it's been performative. They've met, but they haven't actually accomplished anything in terms of decreasing North Korea's ability to build and hold out themselves as a nuclear power. Whereas that's what the goal was, to prevent North Korea from gaining nuclear weapons. I think his policy with Iran has been a failure as well.
Yeah, a lot of people agree with that too. Like with the whole, because Obama had a great deal to stop Iran from expanding their nuclear presence in the world, and Trump just took that deal and ripped it in 3 different ways.
Sure. And so, you have Donald Trump, who thinks that he's right about everything without really considering the views of other people other than his base. And then you have somebody like President Obama and somebody like President George W. Bush, even more than Donald Trump. Much as you might disagree with George W. Bush's policies and actions in office, and much as his administration was responsible for the war in Iraq and an incalculable human cost that came with that, at the end of the day, George W. Bush was a president who who led with a sense of what America's place in the world was and the role that America could play. Yeah. But with Donald Trump, you have somebody who's leading with a sense of what his personal grievances are and what he wants the world to look like, and try and shape it in that authoritarian way. And his base, rather than reflecting the views of his base reflects the views that he has. That's how it seems. Yeah. And so, that's the difference between previous American presidents and Donald Trump, where the person in power today who really just wants to, and the reason I'm saying this is because the polls that are placing him, 10 points behind, et cetera, they reflect the fact that even his base doesn't agree with some of his policies.
Yeah.
Because more than his base might be, anywhere from 35 to 40 something percent of the American population who agree with him or approve of him. But then when you look at the numbers for things like, should Amy Coney Barrett be given a shot at being nominated to the Supreme Court and confirmed for the Supreme Court, the majority of the American people think that Supreme Court seat should not be filled until after the election, according to polls. And when it comes to things like mask wearing and social distancing, again, the majority of the American population in polls suggests that, those are policies that most of the people are in favor of. So Donald Trump is, again, appealing not only to it's not only his base is smaller than that chunk of the electorate that thinks, or the polled public that don't believe in some of his policies. So he's getting it wrong, is I guess what I'm saying, and that's confusing to me.
Yeah. So one last before we go, I want to end with how right now we're less than 2 weeks out to the election. Here was my prediction going in, but Jody's prediction. I'm still going to stand by my prediction for a bit, but Jody's has made me reconsider my prediction a little bit. My prediction is contingent on whether or not he wins or loses. Sorry, is contingent on whether or not he loses. I personally feel like I'm kind of with the polls for now. I'm going in thinking he's going to lose because, first of all, the geopolitical climate of America it's a night and day difference from what it was in 2016, because there wasn't a borderline economic depression in 2016. There wasn't a pandemic. There wasn't the threats that Donald Trump capitalized on were threats that the people sided with him on, like, preventing more terrorism that he was calling attention to. I do think he blew that out of proportion, but it worked, unfortunately. And the only thing he's got right now going for him in terms of an argument for why he should be reelected is, if you elect Biden, the country's going to go to radical leftist anarchists, and there's going to be disorder in the streets. Your suburbs are going to be destroyed. And when he says that, that's a really racist argument, because what he's actually saying is he knows that Donald Trump, I believe, is smart enough to understand that suburbs in America are heavily inhabited by immigrants, and that means black and brown people, people of color. They're there in the suburbs, and he's going to say, if you elect Biden, who does not care about law and order, and funny enough, he's polling below Biden on the issue of law and order, which is funny to me. But he's saying that your country's going to go to anarchist hell if you vote for Biden. That's the only argument he has. And just like how Hillary's argument in 2016 was, you're sexist if you don't vote for me, the general public who is indifferent to any president is going to hear Trump's argument, and they're going to say, screw you, don't make me wrong for voting for someone who isn't you. You let us down. Like, the country's in crisis and you're not doing anything about it. So I think, given the fact that the country's in crisis and they're on the verge of an economic depression, he's going to lose based on that. But he's not going to lose because Biden's going to win. I feel like Biden is going to snag the election inadvertently and in a backhanded manner, the way Trump snagged it from Hillary, because Trump wasn't expecting to win against Hillary. If anything, his run against Hillary was him puffing his chest against the establishment and inspiring Americans to do so. And it worked. But when he won, it's like, oh shit, now I have to run things. All his argument is if you vote for Biden, your country's going to go to hell. And people hate that argument, because we said the same thing about Trump in 2016. If you vote for Trump, the country's going to go to hell. And people were like, screw you. Like, we want change. Trump is change. We don't care what kind of change it is right now. We don't know what kind of change it will be, but we're going to vote for him. They voted for him. And now that's why I think Biden is going to win inadvertently. But what my fear is what happens when the votes are all counted, and if it does come in favor of Biden, how Trump is going to respond. There's something I'd like to briefly clarify our readers on, or our listeners on, FLQ. If you're Canadian, FLQ is one of the most dastardly terrorist events in Canadian history. The province of Quebec in Canada has had a history of wanting to separate, and in the late 60s, French President Charles de Gaulle paid a visit to Quebec City, the provincial capital of the province, and he made a very controversial speech where he said, "Vive le Québec libre." And now that basically meant, long live a free Quebec, because he incited the idea in Quebecers' minds that this province should be independent from the rest of Canada because we're the francophones who don't fit in with English, with an otherwise English-speaking country. Therefore, we want to be our own nation. And in the early 1970s, the FLQ was a terrorist organization that actually took hostages and bombed post boxes across the country. And it was so severe, As'ad, that my dad likes to tell the story because my dad was a university student living in Ottawa at the time. Ottawa was put under military lockdown, and Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, was the guy in charge, and he basically handled the situation with a measure that a lot of people thought was very authoritarian, because Canadians were not used to seeing guys with guns, the army occupying a city. So the reason why I bring up the FLQ is because I have a feeling that, given how Trump rallied dangerous people to his cause, my fear is that if he loses, we're going to see something like the FLQ on steroids in the United States.
Yeah. So just to begin again, in terms of addressing the idea that the polls are wrong, and that, Jody's suggestion that Donald Trump is likely to win because the pollsters are still wrong, just like they were in 2016. I think that, my perspective is, I've read some news stories. Again, we'll find out ultimately when the American public decides with their votes who's right and who's wrong. But there have been a number of stories written beginning in July about how polls and polling practices have changed since the polling practices in 2016. There are different pollsters who have written articles for the Atlantic Monthly, for Politico magazine. They have written about how polls and polling practices have changed. They've written that that pollsters have since worked actively to correct the deficiencies that existed with the 2016 polls, because again, those polls had Hillary Clinton with a 20-point or 10-point plus double-digit advantage in all the polls, and yet she still lost. Again, I want to go back to the point I made in the earlier part of the podcast that Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote, but it was those battleground states that have electoral votes in certain segments of those states that she then lost on, and that's how Donald Trump got elected ultimately, because he won those battleground states. And much has been made of the fact that Hillary Clinton did not court the vote in Wisconsin, the state that she was expected to win, but ultimately lost. And all those electoral votes ultimately went to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
So I think what's different from 2016 now is how acutely aware of the Biden campaign is of the need to appeal to voters across all demographics and not to neglect voters anywhere, number one. Number two, pollsters have written about how they are now waiting for the fact that they might be only attracting in their polls people who are members of the college-educated public. Now, a pollster in The Atlantic, for example, wrote how in 2016, his polls were where when he conducted polls, they had the data to show that those without a four-year degree made up 40% of his survey respondents, whereas now in his polling, they count for 60%. And he wrote that whites without a college degree were 33% of his surveys. Today, they are 43%. So these kinds of changes are changes that pollsters are actively making to, account for the fact that they got it wrong in 2016. So they're adding more respondents to their polls that account for the fact that we need to hit chunks of the electorate that we were not reaching before and ask them the same questions that we were asking to those previous chunks of the electorate that we reached, and make sure that our responses more accurately reflect a broader demographic than just those that we were reaching with our polls back in 2016.
That's a good point.
Are now that, again, Biden is ahead in those kinds of polls. So those polls have been changed and Biden's still ahead by double-digit lead. So I do have more confidence in the polls than I did in 2016. And I do have reason to believe, if these newspaper reports are right, that polling has changed. So I'm more optimistic than I'm pessimistic that Biden will defeat Trump. And I think that the country was ready for a change in 2016. And I think they're ready for a change again. I think the past 4 years have been too tumultuous. And I think that there are people, in the Trump base and the MAGA world that talk about the Trump silent majority. They say, hey, you're not reaching those people by polling. And we're going to have a huge turnout on election day and before election day of people who are the silent majority who are going to vote for Trump, but they're too afraid to admit it. I think that's actually wrong. I think that the people who are Trump supporters have been emboldened by his 4 years in power. And so now news reports have been saying that, you can drive around the country and you'll see Trump signs everywhere and you'll see fewer Biden signs, which is directly contradicting all the polls where Biden is ahead and Trump is in the minority. I think that people who do support Trump are not a silent majority anymore. They are there, and they're happy to claim that they're Trump supporters. Whereas people who are Biden voters or prospective Biden voters are less likely to say that out loud because they don't want to be shouted down by their Trump supporting community as well. So I think that there's more of a solid majority out there for Joe Biden than there is for Donald Trump. And so I think that when you get voters, not only are you going to get the people who are polling and who are out and out for Biden, I think you're going to get people who are silently in favor of a change from Donald Trump, whether or not they support Joe Biden or whether or not they support the Democratic Party. They're going to ultimately cast their vote in favor of change from the status quo, because the status quo, while, in conversations we may want to, tell people what we believe and what we think, in our heart of hearts, we know what's going on.
Exactly.
And I think a lot of people are going to go out there in their heart of hearts, they know that the world today is it's in worse shape than it was 4 years ago. And that in America specifically, that is in large part thanks to the politics and the policies of Donald J. Trump.
Yeah, exactly. So the reason why I brought up the FLQ was because he told in that debate with Biden, he told his wife, he told the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by. It was a very disturbing message. And I was reading this morning, right before I recorded this podcast, that there was some 13 men in Michigan got busted for conspiring to abduct the governor, who is a Democrat, and they're all linked to white nationalism, and so my fear, which I really hope does not come true, is in a climate where Trump is the loser and he has to accept it, what's the transition of power going to look like? Given how I've been dealing with, put it this way, I'm just to disclose something. I'm currently being harassed by a sociopath who writes Facebook tweets. Who writes Facebook? Sorry, I'm dealing with a guy who writes Facebook posts the same way that Trump tweets. Based on that guy's relentlessness in his ability to harass myself and other people that he's done in the past, I can't see Trump accepting a loss. And his ego won't let him because Joe Biden is this guy that he can't afford to lose to. In Trump's world, Joe Biden is a senile old man. That is going to be humiliating if Trump loses to him. So, my fear is what happens to the culture in the lame duck months, which is from November to January 20th when his term officially ends. And ultimately, maybe if the feds have to get involved, then I personally don't think there's going to be a civil war, because I can't see a civil war starting over who the president is. Just sounds like an outrageous concept to me. Like it's just grounded in lunacy. Like, are you so attached to who your president is that you're gonna go, out and declare like your own private war on the public? Like, that's not democracy. So I have a feeling that if anyone tries to do anything funny, it'll be a small group of people, and the feds will stop him pretty quickly. If Trump has to be escorted out of the White House in handcuffs because he won't leave, then so be it. But and keep in mind, audience, this is all contingent on whether or not he loses. We still don't know. A lot can happen in 2 weeks. So all we can kind of do is just speculate right now. But that's my fear, and that's where it's at.
Yeah. So just to sort of wrap up and give my last thoughts before we, schedule a part two. I think, I do think that there is, again, the possibility that Donald Trump wins. And I think that this possibility, more than any other group that's acknowledging this possibility, you have Joe Biden's campaign, where they have been sending out internal memos recently, acknowledging the fact that the race is way closer than you may think from the media that you're reading. Right. Joe Biden's is putting out the message. They're saying, hey, I think his campaign manager recently tweeted that the race is, quote, way closer, quote, than you may think based on what you're reading in the media, in the mainstream media and the internet media and social media. It's way closer than that. And the Biden campaign is acutely aware of that. So they're not settling down. They're still operating with a sense of, respect for the fact that Donald Trump has this massive campaign, this huge appeal to a large chunk of the American electorate that is his base. So nobody's resting on their laurels right now. And I think that's, again, the big difference from the 2016 situation, where everyone just assumed that Hillary Clinton was winning. And so there was a sense of entitlement and a sense of, a fait accompli that Hillary Clinton's campaign was operating with. And there is no fait accompli here. Like, I think Joe Biden's campaign is very much acknowledging, our guy could lose, and we need to fight with our very last breaths for this to happen. So again, I think the situation is slightly different from 2016. And then speaking to your experience that you're having currently, where unfortunately, and I'm very sorry to hear this, that you're being harassed by this person whose name we won't say, but I know who they are, because based on the fact that they've been doing this consistently for many years now, and I'm aware of that. It's unfortunate. I feel sad for I feel compassion for you for what you're going through, and I feel sad for the person themselves that is their life right now.
Yeah,
they're only able to bolster their kind of need. Their needs by going after somebody else. And I do agree that Donald Trump has this pathological experience where he's only really able to thrive and sustain his own interest in his life by beating and bullying on other people. That's all he knows. So I do think that he will have a hard time accepting the results of an election where he doesn't win the Electoral College votes he needs to become the next president of the United States. But I do agree with you that while there are people in power and authority and influence and, highly placed and experienced academics and journalists who are conducting war games, essentially, they're doing these war game scenarios where they get a number of people together and they game out what happens if in various scenarios where a recount is needed, or if the election goes to the Supreme Court. The New Yorker has conducted this kind of exercise. Other organizations have conducted this kind of exercise where, people who have political experience are conducting war games and gaming out different scenarios. And so those are, I think it's great that those people are doing all of that. But as an average person who's, again, not an American citizen, but who's lived there for 9 years and who's living in Canada now and has a great deal of interest, I think that I agree with you, there will be no civil war. This is not like the 1800s where you had states seceding because they believed in their fundamental right to conduct their, their cultures and their economies based on an allegiance to perpetuating slavery. This is not that situation. We don't have people who are so wedded to an economic interest that they need to, bear arms and take up arms and fight against the other half of the country. I think that that's different. I think that also back then, the views of the public were largely aligned with the views of their leaders. And so you have Donald Trump's base MAGA world, who are into him because he appeals to their sensibilities and to their sense of economic right and wrong. And he also, beyond that, appeals to their need for entertainment. They find him very entertaining. This is a segment of the American public that grew up watching World Wrestling Federation, The Rock. Can you smell what The Rock is cooking?
Yeah.
And I don't want to caricature again people. I'm sure there are many people of Trump supporters that have no interest in World Wrestling Federation wrestling. And to those people, I apologize. I don't want to caricature you or tar you with the same brush or make you into a monolithic segment. Again, as Jody was saying, there are people who wanted something different and who were disillusioned for good reason with the Democratic Party in 2016.
Yeah.
So there are grievances that are worth having. Having said that, I do think that there are a lot of people who do vote for Donald Trump because he excites them and he appeals to their desire for this, grandiose, powerful figure who says what he thinks and who just takes the world by storm. And they're for somebody who they perceive to be a winner, who reflects their own sensibilities of what it's like to be a winner in their own lives. I think that that's not a reason to have a civil war, though. I don't think that those people will be willing to take their need and their desire for fun and excitement so far as to take up arms against the rest of the country. So I don't think there'll be civil war. And finally, I do think that the Civil War is an enduring wound in the American Republic. It's still an enduring wound. And that's showcased in the division that exists between North and South and Midwest and the coasts. And I don't think that anybody wants to revisit that particular experience. And I don't think that the military in America would let that happen. I do think that despite how far gone somebody like Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky is in terms of his thirst for power and his ability to direct the politics of the United States of America, I don't think that anybody like that would stand for a Trump refusal to leave the White House and negate or stop the transition of power to a next presidency.
Yeah. Well, when it comes down to it, I feel like I agree. I feel like if Trump loses, I think he'll get very little support within the Republican establishment and the Republican caucus because they're not going to sit back and say, they're going to say, okay, your time's up. You lost. Go away. Because they told the same thing to Mitt Romney. When Mitt Romney lost to Obama, he faded from relevancy and the party didn't really take his advice and his nuance into politics seriously anymore. The Democrat establishment did something. It's typically what happens across party lines when someone loses an election. They're disgraced by their party. In the rule of politics, if you lose an election, your credibility diminishes incredibly. So I don't think there will be a political party anywhere in the West that will take a loss and actually give it some credibility or try to say the thing was rigged or whatever. It didn't happen in Canada with Scheer. It didn't happen, anywhere else. So
with Mitt Romney in the United States,
that
was the end.
Exactly. So I feel like the Republican caucus is going to say, okay, Donald, you lost. We're sorry. We tried to keep you in power, but you need to go. So, yeah. So basically, all of this is contingent on what happens on election night. Do you think like we're gonna see a winner on election night? Because there is the possibility that we could go into a 2000 scenario where we don't know who the winner is for days or weeks.
I think that there's been a ton of early voting. So early voting has reached unprecedented heights compared to previous elections, where you've got massive turnout that's already happening on both sides, Republican and Democrat. So I'm hopeful that a lot of people will have already voted by election day, and then when election day actually happens, the massive turnout that you'll see on that particular day as well, November 4th, or whatever the actual day is. I guess that would be, gosh, it's coming up, right? It's probably November 3rd or 4th.
November 3rd. It's a Tuesday. Yeah.
Tuesday, November 3rd, because Tuesday is always election day. So you have November 3rd, but you have a lot of people. I know a lot of Americans, personally, friends I have in America, who have already gone out and voted. And we've been seeing reports of historic voting turnouts in Colorado and other states. So I do think that, I'm not too worried that people won't have voted by then, but there will be places where votes are still being counted. So I don't think it's going to be known necessarily on election night. However, again, you may have Fox News Network calling an election for Trump, and you may have CNN calling an election for Biden. So you may have cable news networks or pundits that are calling an election in favor of one candidate or the other based on the exit poll numbers that they're seeing. So we'll find out what happens. I think that both candidate campaigns are going to have a policy in place where neither will concede without fighting the results, no matter what the results are. Unless you see an election night that really show that one has trounced the other, where, it's like a Reagan-Mondale victory, where in 1984 you had, Reagan win 49 states electoral votes, and Mondale only carried one state. So that's a kind of victory that you need to see from one side or the other for neither candidate for the candidate to just concede outright. I think that if it's not that way, then neither candidate is going to concede, and you're going to see a scenario where there's going to be a couple of days, and potentially it could go to the Supreme Court. So we'll see.
Yeah, that's true. I feel like if all the mainstream news outlets are smart, no one will call election. Breitbart might call it in favor of Trump. The Guardian might call it in favor of Biden. Those are like far.
Right.
Huffington Post might call it in favor of Biden. But if these news outlets are all smart, they're not going to call anything until all the numbers come in. And I personally disagree with your point that Fox News might call it. I don't think they can't afford that, because if they call it wrong, their stock plummets. So they can't afford that, and especially in a time like this, they can't afford that. So
you might be right about Fox News, actually, but I think that networks are going to be out there looking to call an election because ultimately they're getting more views and more ratings. So they still do. They operate ultimately in the world of incentives, and the world of incentives for them is a very, very much a moment by moment world that has existed ever since the concept of breaking news was first developed by CNN when Princess Diana died back in the 90s.
Yeah.
The term breaking news did not exist before Princess Diana died.
Oh, wow.
And that's when, so that headline that you see all the time, breaking news, that was invented by CNN when Princess Diana died. And that was the first instance of breaking news. Like, wow, this is breaking news. We have to interrupt everything to show you that this crazy thing has happened. Right. And so now everywhere all the time you get breaking news, and that's what rules the media world. It's like everybody has to be first to report, to have that exclusive, to have that breaking news, to get their people to tune in. So we'll see what happens ultimately in terms of calling the election. But is that people will not. I do think that ultimately neither candidate will concede easily. But I do still believe that the polls have changed since 2016, and the Biden campaign has reason to be cautiously optimistic, but continue to fight like they're about to lose no matter what, so that they can have their best chance of winning.
That's true. So again, we'll see what happens, but Tuesday, November the 3rd, America, that's your day to actually make a stand for what the kind of country you want for the next 4 years. Please go out and vote. We say this as your friends and your allies around the world. We're looking out for you. We empathize with your situation, no matter how grim it may look. And we want the best for everyone in this country. Even the people that we don't agree with, we want the best for them. Like, I would want Trump supporters to live the best lives possible. I'm not a very vengeful person. I do believe in karma, but I also believe that everyone has the right to everything we've talked about positively in this podcast. Just a right to understanding, a right to respect, and a right to a voice. And everyone gets to use that on election day. So stay tuned for part 2, where I bring back Jody Aberdeen and As'ad Hamid. We're going to have a lot to say post-election. So, As'ad, my friend, thank you so very much. And we'll see you later.
Well, thank you, Evan. It was a pleasure being here and participating in your podcast and working with you and Jody today to flesh out some of the possibilities for the election and revisit the past. I look forward to hanging out again and talking more.
Yes, great. All right, see you guys.